All right, the world is hoping for a vaccine that will slow the spread of the deadly coronavirus, and now the race to get a safe and effective one is inching closer to the finish line. Two U.S. pharmaceutical giants, Pfizer and Moderna, are currently in phase 3, which is the final phase of vaccine development before approval for public use. And it looks like Pfizer's booster shots are on track for regulatory review as early as October. Dr. Bob Lahita is here to help us break down the next steps in the process. So, Dr. Bob, one of the things that I'm really curious about and your take on is Oxford University is expected to start its trials in the U.S. this month. As these companies are getting further along in their studies, are we seeing what are you hearing about adverse effects that these vaccines may have?
Adverse effects, none. The only adverse effect that has been described by most vaccine directors of research has been slight fever, perhaps an ache at the site of the injection, but that's about it. And that's wonderful. It looks like, Vlad, there are going to be 2 shots involved because the studies that have now come out of the Pfizer program and Moderna have indicated that the antibody response is good after the first shot and then terrific after the second shot. So adaptive immunity is robust, and that's a good term, robust. And the T cells and the T cell response is spectacular from what I have heard. So it's very, very promising.
So what's the time frame that we're looking at, Dr. Bob? When could we expect this to get to market? When could I expect to get a vaccine?
That's a good question, Vlad. Well, it's well tolerated. I've said it's a mild fever. So far, 11,000 people have been enrolled in phase 3. And phase 3 is what is called the efficacy study. So the efficacy study says how valid is the vaccine in large populations with different age groups. And so that the FDA review, if everything goes well, 11,000 so far, we'd like to have 30,000 enrollees in this phase 3 trial. It would go to the FDA in October, which is basically a little over a month from now. If regulatory gives the okay, 100 million doses will be ready by the end of this year. And by the end of 2021, we're expecting 1.3 billion doses. And that's extremely exciting because if this vaccine works, as it looks like it's going to work, we'll have herd immunity by the middle of next year. And if we have herd immunity, as you know, basically the virus sort of disappears. And that's very, very hopeful.
And so, Dr. Bob, would I have to get a shot every year like I do for the flu season? Or would this be, a shot that you get like when you're a kid, you get your MMR shots, for example, and you're good to go?
Well, that's a good question, Vlad. I actually would think that this would be like influenza, that you would get it every year. The reason I'm saying that is because we know now that the coronavirus itself and that whole class and family of viruses, it mutates with frequency. Now, it's been mutating since January, and it hasn't caused any major issues that have been worse than what we saw in February or March. However, because of that, it's possible, and I am not a coronavirus expert, it's possible that we would have to be immunized every year. And the way I see it is that might be a combo vaccine with influenza every fall for us in the upper hemisphere. So I'm saying that, but I am not, again, a coronavirus expert, but I would assume that's what I would do if I were an epidemiologist. And since we don't know what the recurrent rate of this virus appearing and infecting people is, we have no idea whether it's going to come back with great force, for example, next year.
So, Dr. Bob, one of the things that I think is interesting, there are reports that there have been some issues enrolling enough volunteers for these vaccine trials, particularly minority groups. What are you hearing about that? How does this affect the trials, if not an entire cross-section of the American population can be a part of these clinical trials?
Yeah, that's very important, Vlad, because, we know that African Americans, Latinos, and the American Indians, for example, are not widely represented in these phase 3 efficacy trials. And in order for them to be really, truly valid, we should have a representation of every ethnicity and every race in the country. And I'm sure there are certain ethnic groups and races that I haven't even thought of. The different races and ethnicities have different susceptibility. And in addition, as I think we've spoken about several weeks ago, the socioeconomic factors play a big part here, because there are people who live together in close proximity, and they have more of a likelihood to transmit the virus one to another. If you're living in a one-bedroom apartment and there are 5 people living in that apartment, for example, the spread of the virus would be greater. So we would like to see representation from every ethnic, every racial group as part of the efficacy trial. If that happens, that will be wonderful. Personally, I don't expect any differences to occur from those who are in the trial currently and perhaps those that we would like to be in the trial. As the vaccine is released, we will begin to see probably greater efficacy, perhaps in those ethnic and racial groups that are adversely affected the most. As you know, African Americans and in general Black people are affected more than Caucasians with regard to the rate of death and the morbidity or the severity of the infection. So that gives us pause. And I'm hoping that our vaccine experts will think about that.
So the federal government announced that it will start surveying the nation's wastewater to better understand the spread of COVID-19 in communities. Do we know, can the coronavirus live in untreated water?
Well, that's a very good point. I saw that report, Vlad, and I know that in hot tubs and in swimming pools, which are chlorinated, the vaccine does not live. Those waters have been tested incessantly for the presence of active virus, because people want to go back to swimming in their swimming pools, plus these large groups of people or children mostly who swim in these outdoor pools want to feel like they are safe. So those waters have been tested. But what has not been tested is wastewater, water from washing machines, from toilets, etc. That hasn't been tested. And I would assume that the virus would not live for any length of time in wastewater, because this virus, as I have said often, is very fastidious. It's got a fatty layer. It's highly proteinaceous on its surface, and I don't think it likes to be around adverse conditions such as ultraviolet light, etc. Wastewater, I'm not so sure about, and I await the data, and it's coming.
You know, just when I read that report, Dr. Bob, I just thought of polio, because, as you know, in the early 1950s, when people were infected with polio, a lot of people became infected because they were swimming or they were drinking water that had this virus in it, until, of course, Dr. Salk solved and brought to the world a vaccine. So that's what made me think that maybe this thing is transmitted or can be transmitted much in the same way that polio was. Are there any lessons to be drawn from that, or am I'm not a doctor, folks, so what do I know?
The lessons that can be drawn from that are that viruses are very innovative, and this virus is no exception. The polio virus was a whole different ball game, and it took years for the vaccine. You remember that herd immunity was established with the oral vaccine, which was able to be given by Dr. Sabin's group. Dr. Salk started growing the virus, or they started growing the virus, Weller and Robbins did. Then Dr. Salk gave it by injection, and then came the oral nasal virus. And so that produced herd immunity. Currently, in wastewater, we have no idea whether this virus lives, and the studies are just beginning to see. Now, bacteria is a whole different ballgame, but this is a virus, and viruses are particles that are non-living. Bacteria, we know, can exist in wastewater and swimming pools and hot tubs, etc. In fact, they like that environment. I don't think most viruses like the environment of water in general.
Yeah, that's why I stay away from those big public pools, Dr. Bob. Thank you very much. As always, great to talk to you, Dr. Bob. Thank you.
Thank you, Vlad.